One summer afternoon in 1797, English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge dozed off after spending the afternoon reading histories of the Far East. When he awoke, he had fully formed in his head a poem of about 200 to 300 lines, and he set about trying to write it down. He was about 50 lines in, when suddenly someone knocked at his door. My name's Dan, this is Bookworm History, and today we're discussing Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So a little shop talk before we get going today. First, a huge thank you to YouTuber Soulpatch59 for suggesting today's topic. I had originally done a Coleridge poem already. I did The Rime of the Ancient Mariner way back when audio-video quality left something to be desired, and I originally wasn't going to do this one. Not that I don't like it, just I had already done a Coleridge poem and didn't think I'd do another one. But it's an awesome story, I love Coleridge, and I'm really excited to take suggestions. So, with that being said, here we go. Kubla Khan, or to use its full name, Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, a Fragment, is a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge that was first published in 1816, and it describes a sort of fictionalized version of Xanadu, the capital city of Kubla Khan. But to discuss the poem and its background in any real kind of comprehensive form, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. And not just 1797 when the poem was first written, we're going all the way back to the 13th century. You see, Kubla Khan was a real person. He was one of the grandchildren of Genghis Khan, and starting in 1260 became the fifth great Khan, or ruler of the Mongolian Empire, although the portion of it that Kubla Khan ruled over was significantly smaller than that which had been conquered by his illustrious grandfather. As his capital, he built the city of Chengdu, where he would establish and expand the Yuan dynasty, which would rule for more than a century. Famed explorer Marco Polo would visit Chengdu, although he would describe it in his book as Shandu, and he would describe the city as incredibly beautiful, surrounded by a wall 16 miles long. He would also describe in detail one of the city's great marvels, the Khan's cane palace, a structure made entirely of cane that could be disassembled at the Khan's whim and carried around with him. So it is with the more remote history. But what about the poem itself? Well, Coleridge actually tells us where his inspiration sprang from. You see, when the poem was first published in 1816, Coleridge wrote a sort of introduction, apology, explanation to go along with it. In the summer of the year 1797, the author, then in ill health, had retired to a lonely farmhouse between Porlock and Linton, on the Exmoor confines of Somerset and Devonshire. In consequence of a slight indisposition, an anodyne had been prescribed, from the effect of which he fell asleep at his chair at the moment that he was reading the following sentence, or words of the same substance, in Purchas's Pilgrimage. Here the Khan Kubla commanded a palace to be built, and a stately garden thereunto, and thus 10 miles of fertile ground were enclosed with a wall. The author continued for about 3 hours in a profound sleep, at least of the external senses, during which time he has the most vivid confidence that he could not have composed less than from 200 to 300 lines, if that indeed can be called composition, in which all the images rose up before him as things, with a parallel production of the correspondent expressions, without any sensation or consciousness of effort. On awaking, he appeared to himself to have a distinct recollection of the whole, and taking his pen, ink, and paper, instantly and eagerly wrote down the lines that are here preserved. Coleridge bumbles the quote quite a bit, and the book that he calls Purchas's Pilgrimage was actually called Purchas His Pilgrimage. It was the first of 3 voluminous sets of travel tales compiled by Samuel Purchas, an English cleric writing in the early 1600s. Despite these books being some of the Renaissance's most famous travel tales, Purchas himself never so much as left the country. Instead, rather than writing original material, he simply compiled accounts of far-off places into these large works. For his description of Kubla Khan's city, which he calls Xanadu, he actually borrows heavily from Marco Polo, although he does leave out a few of Polo's details. In his own words, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan build a stately palace, encompassing 16 miles of plain ground with a wall, wherein are fertile meadows, pleasant springs, delightful streams, and all sorts of beasts of chase and game, and in the middle thereof a sumptuous house of pleasure, which may be removed from place to place." From this quote from Purchas, it's easy to see where Coleridge's inspiration came from. Per the actual poem, In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. Coleridge does take some liberties with the geography in his account of Xanadu. He, for one thing, changes the city's name, again, from Xanadu, as seen in Purchas, to Xanadu, presumably because he liked the sound of it, and also, since he was writing a poem, he needed the extra syllable. He also changes Polo's and Purchas's 16-mile wall to twice 5 miles, and the river Alf doesn't actually exist. He could have been referring to the Alphus River, but that's in Greece rather than Asia, which is where he was talking about, although Coleridge does draw sources from various other points on the globe to compile this sort of fictionalized account of Xanadu. Case in point, later on in the poem, Coleridge talks of an Abyssinian woman singing a song of Mount Abora. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Coleridge borrowed from John Milton's Paradise Lost for this image, wherein we find the lines, "Nor were Abyssin kings their issue guard Mount Amara, though this by some supposed true paradise, under the Ethiop line by Nilus head, enclosed with shining rock, a whole day's journey high." Sure, in the 1816 version, Coleridge uses Mount Abora, which is fictional, whereas Milton writes of Mount Amara, which was considered to be a real place, and it's easy to say that the two are unrelated. But there is actually a manuscript copy of Kubla Khan that exists. It's called the Crewe manuscript, and it must have been written some point between 1797, when Coleridge first composed the poem, and 1816, when it was first published. And the reason that we say that is because in the manuscript copy, Coleridge also uses Mount Amara, a direct line to Milton. One of the more fascinating aspects of the story of Kubla Khan is the idea of it as a fragment. Coleridge tells us in the introduction that when he awoke, he conceived of the poem as having 200 to 300 lines, and yet the published version clocks in at a mere 54. So what happened? Well, in Coleridge's own words, to continue with the introduction to the poem, "At this moment he was unfortunately called out by a person on business from Porlock, and detained by him above an hour, and on his return to his room found, to his no small surprise and mortification, that though he still retained some vague and dim recollection of the general purport of the vision, yet, with the exception of some 8 or 10 scattered lines and images, all the rest had passed away, like the images on the surface of a stream into which a stone had been cast, but alas, without the after restoration of the latter." By his own account, Coleridge blames the short run on a person on business from Porlock. He was interrupted at his writing, and by the time he got back to it, the vision had all but left him. Whether this is actually true or not, people have been debating for years. What is certain is the impression this person from Porlock has left on our literary consciousness. For hundreds of years, people have been debating who they actually were, whether they actually existed, and the person from Porlock has become a symbol of everything from unwanted or untimely interruptions to an artist's laziness or sloth. The person has crept up in literature again and again. Everything from Sherlock Holmes' novel The Valley of Fear by Arthur Conan Doyle to Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, even to Douglas Adams and Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. Well, that's all I've got for you today. For more on Coleridge and his writing process and the sources and inspirations that he used for Kubla Khan, as well as The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, you can check out The Road to Xanadu by John Livingston Lowes. It was first published in 1927, so some of the information may be a little out of date, but overall it's an incredibly thorough work on the sources and method that Coleridge used for these two very famous poems. If you want more interesting and unusual stories, be sure to check out the website bookwormhistory.com. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for stopping by.